All right, hi everybody. Welcome to, what is this, year number 10?
11.
11. Year number 11 of the Pirkei Avot class. And today is the 15th of January 2020. And we're going to, our classes will run about between 50 minutes and an hour. I know for some of you this is year number 11, and for you, so
year number 12.
Year number 12. So year number 12, and for some of you this is the first class that you're taking in the study of Pirkei Avot. So today is going to be a bit of an introduction and a little bit of background before we dive into the text. If you did not get a copy of the textbook, let Leora know. She ordered some, but they didn't come in. But you won't need it for today in any case, because the one Mishnah that we are going to look at, I put on the source sheet, so that'll make things a little bit easier. I just want to take a brief moment and go around in terms of introductions. So what I'd like you to do is just say your name and something memorable from your life in 2020, or 2019, maybe a little more work. So I'll start. Aaron Krupnik, and most memorable for me in 2019 was our daughter Ellie got married on Thanksgiving.
You had an easy one, I have to say. So, Chaim Cantor, probably the most memorable thing for 2019, positive one, was my son graduating from college.
Hi, I'm Heidi Kagan, and I would say that one of the most positive things I experienced in 2020 was the support of the Bethel family for our family going through hard times.
I'm Barbara France. Recently I had some family health issues that were very remarkable for my life, but I have to do on the positive note, I'm celebrating 2 little granddaughters who I'm truly loving.
Marvin Sattel, in 2019 we had the birth of our granddaughter, Esme.
Aaron Sattel, same for beautiful Esme. Never heard of the
What a
name
coincidence.
before, but
What's the name?
I'm getting used to
Esme.
it. E-S-E-S-M-E, Esme.
You're a Challenger
Never
fan,
heard
you
of
know.
it. Okay.
If not, you don't know.
We kept saying, what? What? How do you say it? How do
This
you
is
say
a
it?
typo, right?
You'll get used to it. Okay.
My name is Rochelle Cohen. I published a poetry book, and I'm happy to say that my sister is very well sitting next to me.
Yeah.
Marion Cohn, sister. I had my 5-year survivor rate for breast cancer last month.
Ditto for me, Yafa Fuchs. And I celebrated 2 big milestones. My son got married, that's a biggie. And my grandson was bar mitzvahed, and I was his teacher. So everything went well, and my husband went through surgery, and he's fine.
Great.
Thank you.
My name's Jennifer Stoffman, and I really don't have anything that memorable that ranks in any of these things for 2019.
So anything you can come up with. Something to remember.
I'm going to pass. That's okay. We're really happy.
My name is Shirley Alpha, and had a wonderful year. 2 great-grandchildren were born. And
Numbers 46 and 47.
16 and 17. Wow. And
16
18
and
is in
17.
vitro.
Okay.
Wow. Yes, and I've been very blessed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Karen Schlessel. In 2019, my son got engaged, and I became president of Bethel.
Yay.
Hi, I'm Marlene Plasky. This past year, I celebrated the bar mitzvah of my grandson.
Melanie Taylor. I think the most memorable thing this year was in the summer when Shira and her family come in from Israel, and all 17 of us are in Ocean City for a few days celebrating together. It's the one time in the year that we're all together.
Shira Gora. I think the most memorable thing is that I became a parent of a driver I'm Amy Rosano, Shira's sister, Mallory's daughter. And we were fortunate, our boys had a special bar mitzvah ceremony this past year. And I think about Shira's visit every summer.
My name's Brad Koenig, and one of the things that come to mind is my son's bar mitzvah.
I'm Martin Sharofsky, and in 2020, my son, after 3 decades, finally graduated college and got engaged.
Jerry Cass, nothing special in 2000.
Okay, Jerry.
And then I guess most memorable is the day a week that I spend with my granddaughter.
Very nice. Okay. Well, thank you for those introductions. By and large, this class will be more conversational than it is today. Today is kind of bringing things up to speed and giving a little bit of background. The first class in the study of Pirkei Avot is always a bit of background, but for those who have been taking the class for years, I wanted to be able to switch it up a little bit so it wasn't the same background that I give each time on the first class. And I know that sitting at the table, there are people with coming in with all different experience in terms of Jewish learning. And so essentially, 2 things. I don't assume that anybody knows anything. And number 2, therefore assume nobody else does either. So if you have a question, just raise your hand. I'll try to repeat it for the people who are watching online.
I think the mic is interfering. I can't hear you. It's very muffled. It'd be better if either.
Is it better?
Very muffled.
Is it better without?
Yes. Yes.
Right? Better without. I certainly don't want it. Okay. So what I would just reiterate, please ask any kind of questions. I don't assume that people are bringing any particular knowledge base here, although people are coming from all different levels of experience in Jewish learning. The timeline that I handed out for you is actually the textbook for Live and Learn, which is our Tuesday night lecture series, lecture discussion series that several of you are in as well. So I'm going to collect them at the end. We may have opportunity to use them again in the class, except for you, Shira. Take it back to Israel and enjoy. But we will probably have opportunity to use them again. It is important for me, though, whenever we're studying Jewish life, whether it is ritual life or history or philosophy, to be able to understand all of Jewish life in a historical perspective, because that's what conservative Judaism is all about. Conservative Judaism is not only about understanding the traditions that were handed to us, but where they came from in order to understand the process of evolution that contributes to them as it does in every other aspect of our lives. Everything in life evolves, and Judaism did not evolve in a vacuum. Moreover, that process of evolution, the ongoing development of the Jewish people, which started even before Abraham, as we're going to talk about today, continues with you. Each of you is part of the process of the evolution of Jewish life. So everything that happens in terms of the Jewish experience are in shul and in the larger world is part of Jewish history. So the fact that every second wedding that takes place amongst a Jewish person today, probably more like 7 in 10, is a Jew to a non-Jew, is part of Jewish history. People who are marrying non-Jews, whether they are having Jewish children or maintaining Jewish family, is part of the ongoing saga of Jewish history, and will influence Jewish history 100 years from now. And anybody who's studying Jewish history 100 years from now will have to look back and understand that the Judaism that they inherited is very much a reflection of the Judaism we live today. That Judaism is not written by scholars, and it's not lived by academics. It's lived by the overall mass of Jewish people worldwide. And it's always been that way. Judaism has always been the interaction of our people with the world around us. And as a result, it continues to evolve in any given time. And the relationship between the political and economic worlds in which we live directly affects the spiritual life of the Jewish people, and always has and always will. Because the bulk of Jewish people don't live in isolated communities, although some do. The bulk of Jewish people, throughout the bulk of Jewish history, have tried their very best to live an integrated life into the world around them. The idea that Jews would choose to live isolated and alone, separate with only Jewish people together, is something that throughout Jewish history has been more forced on Jews than chosen. We didn't choose to live in ghettos. We were put in ghettos. We choose most of the time to live associated with the world around us. And that interaction continues to the ongoing development, not only of Judaism, but really of our understanding of what God wants for us as the Jewish people.
But some streams do choose to live.
Yeah, but I'm just saying the majority. I said with certain examples, but by and large, the history of Jewish people has not been Muncie. The bulk of Jewish life has been not Borough Park, but the rest of New York, the rest of the United States. The vast, vast majority of Jews in the world live an integrated life. Now that population demographics are more challenging, Israel, that number, that percentage may shift over time, but throughout most of Jewish history. So therefore, our approach is always going to be seeing the historical continuum of Jewish development. And so therefore, to be able to, on one hand, somebody could give you a book like Pirkei Avot and say, okay, let's open it up and let's just study and see what it says. But if you don't understand where it came from and as a product of its milieu, we're not going to understand its relevance to us as modern Jews. We'll rather understand it as some historical document that was interesting way back when, but not something that was intended to have our active participation throughout the course of Jewish history. Okay, so let's take a look. And again, if you're interested, by the way, in this Tuesday night, you can still come any Tuesday night at 7 o'clock. And we just started, last week was our first week in the history semester, which this is the textbook of. And you can come and drop in on that class. It's about an hour and a half, and it's taught by the Bethel clergy, me, Chazan Parensboro, and Rabbi Marshall mostly taught the first semester that dealt with prayer, and Rabbi Green and I are mostly teaching the second semester that deals with Jewish history. So I just wanted you to take a quick look and see this, because this is a fantastic tool here in your hands. And I want you to just take a quick look starting on the far left. The graph itself shows the population of Jews in millions, and you can see that that it peaked sometime around 800 before the Common Era, then didn't peak again really until somewhere around leading up to the destruction of the temple, just to the right of the number 1 across that bottom line. And then on the right-hand side, far right, you can see that there are now way more Jews in the world than there ever have been in the past, but which makes sense because there's a heck of a lot more people in the world than there ever were before. And so one of the, so if you follow that, and you can see it has world events, Jewish historical figures, Jewish literature, and the Hebrew year at the very bottom, starting with the year number 1, which is estimated to be 3761 before the Common Era, although that's only working backwards, assuming that the year now is 5780. Okay. If you start out on the left-hand side, you see that Jewish history starts at the year 1, and as we move further to the right, you get the flood. And this is pre-Jewish history. There really are no Jews in the world. The Torah starts out, as we're going to talk about in just a moment, before there are Jews. And then really the first historical period that we have any evidence of is Egypt and the Canaanites. And that goes along from about 1800 before the Common Era, all the way up to around, give or take a year, the end of the Exodus from Egypt, which is purported to be somewhere around 1250 before the Common Era. Then comes Judges. In other words, the Jewish people enter into the land of Israel. They are ruled by no central king, no central authority, but individual municipalities are ruled by judges. Ultimately, in the year 1000 or so, the Jewish people say, we want a king appointed. God says it's okay to have a king appointed, and the period of Jewish monarchy begins. That monarchy period, in spite of the destruction of the temple, ends in the blue section with the destruction of the temple around 586 before the Common Era. That's where that blue period ends, Judah and Babylon and Assyria. Jews go into exile into the what is modern day Iraq, ancient Persia, and that Persian period continues until the Greeks ultimately beat the Persians. The Jews are allowed to come back into the land of Israel, resettle the land, rebuild the temple, and the population begins to rise. As the population begins to rise under the Greeks, more and more interchange between Jews and the world around them, Jews and the intellectual life of the cluster around the Mediterranean Sea, particularly Greek and the Egyptian scholarship. That is interrupted by a short period of corruption, Jewish triumph, but ultimately corruption during the Hasmoneans, which is the period of Hanukkah. Underneath that little section, everybody with me, where it says the blue period of the Hasmoneans, that you begin to have some study of Judaism taking place amongst zugot. Zugot literally means pairs. Judaism is best studied in conversation, and these pairs begin to interpret Torah in a way that we're going to talk about shortly. It is during this period of these zugot, when Torah begins to become more discussed and disseminated amongst the average Jewish person, that it becomes much more democratized. Ultimately, the temple is destroyed at the peak of Jewish population, 4.4 million, in the year 70. Everybody see where that precipitous decline takes place? Yeah? Everybody with me? I'm not going, you got me? Okay, that precipitous decline takes place. It is right at that time when Judaism is on the ropes. The temple has been destroyed. The connection between God and the Jewish people is tenuous because that area of intersect, it's almost like we were unplugged from the receptacle, which the temple was, puts Judaism in a tumult. That's the time period of the rabbis and Pirkei Avot and some of the wisdom that we are going to study. What happens essentially is that Judaism then becomes not temple-centered, but now is in outside of the temple. The leadership is no longer the Kohanim, we're going to come back to that, but the rabbis. And the rabbis are the authors of this section of Pirkei Avot. It begins what is known as the Talmudic period. That Talmudic period runs from about the year 70 at the destruction. Tanaim are the first teachers of rabbinic Judaism. Amoraim are their students. Savuraim are those who come after the Talmud is actually codified, and we're going to study about what the Talmud is. And then the Jewish continuum of rabbinic leadership continues until me. So I am the inheritor of what happened after 70. Sorry, this is as good as it gets.
What's the decline? Like over 2.5 million Jews in around year 70
You speak
were
up.
killed.
I'll repeat the question. Yeah. So the question, Chaim's question is, what gives rise to the rapid destruction of Jewish population after the destruction of the temple? So part of it is just homicide. That many Jewish people were killed, but also losing that central location. Jews, the diaspora. Led to a tremendous amount of Jews intermingling with the world around them, intermarrying into the world, and also, quite frankly, the lack of demographic evidence. So you can't really say categorically what happened because of that dispersal. There wasn't a real strong central way of understanding exactly how many.
Is that right around year 70?
What's that?
Is that right around year 70?
Yes.
That was the question. Why did over 2 million Jews disappear?
Right. I just want to make sure I'm on the right
So
place.
basically, exactly. The population tends to decrease, but primarily the population that decreases most precipitously is realize, Chaim, when you're looking at it, the blue is in the land of Israel. So in the land of Israel, the population's cut basically in half. It's really that diaspora Judaism, which is the top orange part, that disappears. Okay. So so I just wanted you to be able to understand sort of when we're talking about Talmudic Judaism, and this Pirkei Avot is a section of the Talmud that has pithy aphorisms that'll help you live a meaningful Jewish life. It has nothing to do with Jewish law. No Jewish law comes from this section. Rather, it is a compendium of Jewish wisdom that was compiled at the same time that Jewish law was beginning to evolve after the destruction of the temple. The reason, of course, that the Jewish law had to evolve rather rapidly is if everything was associated with one particular building and the people who facilitated the use of that building, and that building was destroyed, those people are out of a job. They can't. There's no more animal sacrifice. There's no more of all of the laws of temple worship, which were so central to Jewish life. The Jewish life is going to continue to evolve. By definition, has to be democratized. It has to be something that's transportable. It has to be something that makes sense to people's lives now that they're trying to deal with the cataclysm of having the locus where God and the Jewish people met destroyed. Can that relationship continue? The answer to that is yes, but only in a totally reinvented understanding of what Judaism is, which is the Judaism that you have inherited, which is rabbinic Judaism, a Judaism that can thrive anywhere and is not limited to any one particular place. Okay, so I give you all of that in terms of background, of historical background. Now I want to switch also, to the theological background, because this will also help us to understand where this Jewish wisdom is rooted. And essentially, it comes from the idea that Judaism brought to the world, and certainly the foundation of our Jewish life, is that God cares about humanity. That God is not so busy doing other stuff. First of all, of course, there is a God, but that God is not so busy that God does not have a relationship with human beings. That is the fundamental message on which all of Judaism is grounded. And that's why the founding stories that we tell about ourselves start with the relationship between God and the first human beings. Because if you don't have a relationship between God and humanity, then everything is just haphazard, circumstance. But if God is connected to humanity, then knowing God will help us grow as human beings. And if God has a particular plan for us, it can lead to our personal and our national and our international, our spiritual growth, and ultimately, in some sense, redemption. And so that's why, because if you think about it, if the Torah is the story of the Jewish people, Abraham, the very first Jew, doesn't come in until many chapters into the book. you have the whole story of Adam and Eve and the Garden of Eden. Then you have 10 generations, and they screw it up, and so you have Noah. And when you get to Noah, God literally flushes the whole thing down the toilet and starts over again. And then finally, after all of that, humanity branches out from the ark, then we start Judaism. Why? Because until you can understand that God has a relationship with all of humanity, then the whole system never gets off the ground. And so in the Torah, God establishes that relationship first with two individuals, first with Adam, or first Adam and Eve. There's two stories in creation, chapter 1 and chapter 2. Chapter 1, man and woman are created together as a pair. Chapter 2, the one that people are more familiar with, God creates a man first, then sees man as lonely, takes a rib, cauterizes the wound, makes a human being out of that rib who becomes woman, and from that all of humanity is descended. The relationship between God and humanity is established with one couple. Following the flood, God's relationship branches out to all of humanity. And God is in relationship with humanity in the same way, essentially, that a parent is in relationship with a child. That's the way the metaphor of Torah works. That God is our heavenly parent, our creator, like your parents were your creators. And God, therefore, as a parent, always is in relationship with their child, no matter how far they stray. God is always going to be in relationship with God's creation, namely humanity. But as every good parent knows, if you don't make rules, if you don't have parameters, you're not doing good parenting. A parent who lets their child grow up on their own gets what they reaps what they sow. I'm not saying that we should all be helicopter parents, but we know that responsible parenting, as I said yesterday to the Taylors at Sue Taylor's funeral, good parenting means giving your kids a set of guidelines that they can live by so that when you're gone, they can live that kind of life, pass that on to the next generation, and optimize the human potential that God has put in each and every one of us. And so interestingly, even before there's a Torah, God gives a Torah to humanity. And that Torah is, the rabbis see, and of course there's all from a Jewish perspective. It's our book, we wrote it, comes from Judaism. But the way that Judaism looks at the world, it's important to understand, because it helps us to understand where Judaism itself comes from. So if you look at your source sheet, I quote from Maimonides. Those of you who are taking Live and Learn, we're going to spend a good bit of time learning about Maimonides in the evening, but let me just leave it at saying that he was a great, one of the greatest rabbinic minds of all time. His name was Moses ben Maimon, therefore his name became Maimonides. He lived in the 11th century, and the saying was, from Moses to Moses, there is none like Moses. So when my first assistant rabbi, Jeffrey Arnowitz, took over in the congregation of my brother-in-law, Jeffrey Siegelman, earlier in the year in 2020, Rabbi Arnowitz asked me to install him at my brother-in-law's shul, where my brother has been for 30 years. And my great line was, from Jeffrey until Jeffrey, there is none like Jeffrey. Brought the house down. Anyhow, so what does Maimonides say? 6 items were commanded to Adam, and they were idolatry, blasphemy, bloodshed, illicit sexuality, theft, and establishing law. God added to Noah the law of not eating flesh from a living animal, which you would go, yeah, who would want to eat flesh from a living animal? Right, which was a lot harder to posit until sushi.
Sushi.
Now I see these shows where they go out on a boat and they catch the animal and then they eat it. You know, it's like a split second before the animal is dead. I can only assume that the animal is dead. When we were in Uganda, the people in Uganda are subsistence farmers. Their per capita income is $606 a year, and they raise all of their own food and they all raise their own livestock, and they have chickens running around and goats, not too many cows, and then they take it and they eat it. You know, and so when we had chicken dinner with the Abu Yudaya, I knew it was very fresh, very fresh, but not alive. So the only thing is you can assume that in ancient world, some people were eating live animals. That's why the Torah had to forbid it. But specifically, it is important to understand, these are as the rabbis posit. Now let me make this perfectly clear. The 10 Commandments are spelled out in the Torah. The 7 commandments of Noah are not spelled out except for not eating the animal. They're much more opaque, but the rabbis discern 7 clear laws. Number 1, do not profane God's oneness in any way. Acknowledge that there's a single God who cares about what we are doing and desires that we take care of God's world. Number 2, do not curse your Creator. No matter how angry you are, don't swear against your Creator. Do not murder. The value of human life cannot be measured. To destroy a single human life is to destroy the entire world, because for that person, the world ceases to exist, at least in this world. The rabbis of the Talmud and Pirkei Avot are banking on the fact that there is a world to come. It is an accepted understanding that this world is but an entryway into the next. Do not eat a limb of a live animal. Respect the life of all God's creatures. As intelligent beings, we have a duty not to cause undue pain to other creatures. Do not steal. Whatever benefits you receive in this world, make sure none of them are at the expense of someone else. Harness and channel the human libido. Incest, adultery, rape are forbidden. The family unit is the foundation of human society. Sexuality is the fountain of human life, and so nothing is more holy than the sexual act. So too, when abused, nothing can be more debasing and destructive to the human being. And number 7, establish courts of law and ensure justice in our world. With every small act of justice, we are restoring harmony to our world, synchronizing it with a divine order. That is why we must keep laws established by our government for the country's stability and harmony, as well as keeping religious law. Now, if these laws look to you as a good basis for Judaism, that's because they are. Because the book of Genesis is, from its outset really to its finish, is about God showing appreciation for humanity and humanity showing appreciation for God in that kind of relationship. And so it starts with one family, one couple, one family. It branches off from that one family into Noah, and his population is repopulating the world. Those people are given a set of laws to live by in our concept. Of course, these are the oldest stories we tell about ourselves. And then from that vast array of humanity who are living by these laws, God chooses one particular person and says, I'm going to have a special relationship with you and with your descendants. And that's where, and that's basically, of course, that's Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Joseph, and that's where the book of Genesis. So then God's relationship went from one couple to one family, the Jacobites, the Josephites. I don't know, they didn't have last names. I don't know. I guess I like to call them the Abrahamskis, because that's their family name, and that's where the book of Genesis ends. Then, at that point,
but then all the Semites
yeah, are Abrahamskis. So, yes, well, not exactly, but yeah.
I have a question. So when God has his initial relationship with Adam and Eve, with the one couple, and then after the flood branched out to families, and humanity was destroyed at the time,
Right.
Okay. And so it was kind of like a redo, like I should have had a relationship with everybody, not just this one couple, so let me start fresh? Or what made humanity get destroyed? It was...
Very, very simple.
Okay.
No, it's very. It's
Sorry,
very,
I just got
no,
stuck
no, no,
on
no,
that.
no.
Yeah.
In a way that you would not necessarily posit, but actually is another strong underpinning. That that sin and punishment are part of God's relationship with humanity. That's what that story is there for. That's why Adam and Eve sinned. That's why the people sinned. That's why Noah sinned. Because if you want to posit a system of law, there has to be accountability and there has to be punishment. Without police in this country, civil law would not exist.
Right, okay.
If you're only relying on the fact that people are going to use their best instincts and their love for fellow humanity to support the world would cease to exist.
Okay.
And so that's why. That's why. But
it's just an example for us to see. This is what happens when I let you be free. So I am parenting you now. To make
right. This is
better.
what happens. No, I love you so much that I'm giving you rules. But understand that these rules that are also for your benefit can be to your detriment when you go astray from them. And that becomes the principle on which all of Judaism is based.
But then in that case, so when he had the relationship with Adam and Eve, he was showing all the bad that could happen. And then he all of a sudden said that you can't
I
have
guess
blood if you-
I'm seeing it more as a metaphor. The stories of Adam and Eve, obviously not historically true. I mean, how would we know? But from the standpoint of the metaphor, because the metaphor continues to throughout all of Jewish history, really up until the Holocaust. After the Holocaust, that's really that's where the metaphor falls apart, because even the things like the destruction of the temples, we Jews attribute to our own misconduct, not to the violence imposed upon us by others. So that idea of reward and punishment undergirds the entire this entire legal system. That legal system, however, was based primarily on temple worship. It was based for a long time on animals that here's the things you should and you shouldn't do, and if you screw up, here's the way you bring the sacrifices, and you get right with God. Once the temple is destroyed, then you need a system for everything else. Okay. That everything else is the Talmud. But the Talmud you didn't need a Talmud when you had the Kohen Gadol and you had everybody doing Judaism in one little area, and you were supposed to have 3 times a year go to that area to be able to live your Judaism. Okay. It makes for.
I'm going to try to view it from that. Okay.
Yeah. So you have to really. I think to look at it, you have to say not what's factually accurate or historically correct, because this is prehistory, and it is the oldest stories that we tell ourselves. So, for instance, just to put a little point on it, it doesn't make a difference whether George Washington chopped down a cherry tree or not. The point of the story is that the founder of our country was an honest man. So the historical fact is irrelevant to the foundational myth on which our country has been established. Okay.
Just a quick question. I have had such a problem with the idea of that God is not punitive, but then there is this there are repercussions for bad behavior. So
you can join a long list of pretty much every Jew.
Yeah. So,
right.
Yeah. So, but what you're saying is that there is punishment, and you will be held accountable. But God is not punitive. It's because of your actions, not.
Let me separate the two things again along the lines of what Barbara was saying. Whether the system factually works that way is scientifically verifiable, I have no idea. But that we tell ourselves this story as a way of making sense of the world and understanding our place in it makes good sense to me. So if something bad happens to you, it doesn't necessarily mean you did anything to deserve it. But if you're asking me, how did Judaism establish the rule of law? It had to be through some idea that punishment exists.
So when it says, like at Yom Kippur, who will die by fire, who will die, is that what you're referring to when you're talking about laws and accountability?
Right. When I take that as a metaphor for you never know what's going to happen. So A, live a good life, and B, make the most of the life that God gives you. That's what it's all about. I don't think that there's a big heavenly book. If there may be, I don't know. I've never been there, you know. But it's the stories that we tell about ourselves that give our lives meaning and focus. That's the purpose. We need to look at Judaism as a system of belief that leads to an end. So if the end is that at the end of Yom Kippur, you are thankful and have great gratitude in your heart for the gift of this new day, it doesn't make a difference to me whether there's a book or there isn't a book. The end result is what I think matters most and what makes us Jewish people and gives our lives spiritual foundation. Okay.
Where it says, do not curse your creator. Do not take it ad verbally against your creator. But I thought we're allowed to be angry at Hashem. I guess you don't use curse words, but...
Yeah, but basically, you're allowed to be angry. But it's to quote the words of my great teacher, Rabbi Isaac Furman. You don't spit in your own kasha. You can be mad at your parents, but you don't curse your parents. Take it, look at it. And the reason why we use the idea of a divine parent is it's the only metaphor we have, especially with us who don't live in a monarchy. So, and even people who do live in a monarchy, I don't think they take that king thing very seriously, quite frankly, unless they choose to leave the royal family. Which is really, I already wrote my sermon for this Shabbos, but I'll give you a little hint that it seems kind of a curious thing to me that modern history is mirroring Torah history when you have the prince turning his back on life in the castle to go on his own way.
That's Moshe.
It's exactly our Torah portion for the Shabbos. Anyhow, so come and hear that. Little ad for the Shabbat. Okay.
That's the trailer.
That's a trailer, exactly. So therefore, yeah, Brad.
I'm still trying to gather my thoughts. So
Okay.
I'm just going to throw it out.
Yeah, that's right. I'm putting a lot out there.
I mean, you spoke about punishment and the stories. These are stories, may not be historical fact. And then the metaphor falls apart at a certain point in our timeline. But some of these stories are, God is punitive punishments, right? And some of these stories are quite severe. And so through my life, I've always had trouble with certain stories in the Torah.
Right.
Passover, the slaying of the firstborn.
Right.
They're children.
Right.
They're not responsible for their parents' actions. Lot, right?
Right.
The whole city destroyed.
Right.
Noah, humanity destroyed. There's
Right.
children that are completely innocent.
Right.
These are stories that I've always had trouble with, but God is punishing.
Right. Right.
What do they?
So I have a couple of things, a couple of responses. Number one is, again, we can't necessarily use it as historical fact, but at the same time, the text is there as a mirror to us. So my first response is that the way that we view the text evolves over time. So and different people will take it at different times. So for instance, people who have just escaped annihilation may be vindictive against their enemy. I was once driving, this is many, many years ago, right after Glasnost and Poland opened up. I went on a FAM tour for rabbis. It was the very first time Poland had been accessible to the West. And I went with a group of rabbis, including a Holocaust survivor who had been at Auschwitz, and with his father. They both survived. When we got to Auschwitz, as we were driving up there, and we were driving by the cemetery, he pulled down the window and he yelled at the cemetery, "It's not big enough. All your people should be here." Now, it's me, who knows why a person died? They might have been, going to save a life and gotten hit by a car. I don't know why they're in the cemetery. But from his standpoint, you killed my family, there's not enough graves for your people. That's the way he reacted to that story. to that situation. The way that we react to those stories is very much, seeing it as a product of its time. But the second thing that I want to point out to you, which is very, very important, is it's not only what the stories say, it's what we have done with them. And the history of the Jewish people, in spite of all of the violence that is in the Torah, have never been that violent people. Never. Never.
So I want to add on Brad's question, specifically to the comment you made now, is, and I do have a problem with all these stories, but even worse, I have a problem with the whole story of the Amalek, where we are commanded to kill children. So this is not a story about God that could be, it's probably just a story. But here there's a clear commandment to kill all of them, to kill the children, to actually do a genocide. So we're commanded to do that. We celebrate it every year when we read it.
And
that bothers me even more.
No, and according to the book itself, I mean, even in the book of Samuel, where Saul loses the kingship because he doesn't kill enough people. There's a lot of very troubling things in there. The question, but to me, the thing that mitigates some of that is that we have never used that as a tool for torture, for subjugation, for any of that. Whereas lots of other people, lots of other, systems have used that as justification. And I think that the texts are deliberately evocative of a particular, to kindle our emotions. And the fact that you're wrestling with these things is important and is part of the process of understanding Torah. Same thing, I mean, time and time again, the stories of Genesis are one dysfunctional family after the next. Anybody who deliberately favors one child over a next in their family is doing bad parenting. We know that's a bad idea, and it happens time and again in the book of Genesis. Okay, so therefore it needs to be subject to continual reinterpretation, and that reinterpretation continues with you, so that the way you tell your children about how to make sense of these stories means that Torah is living through you. I think that's its primary purpose. And yet there is no lack of difficult stories, to deal with. But the question that we should be asking ourselves is, why do we tell these stories about ourselves? Let's take the historical element out of it entirely, and just say, of the foundational stories of the Jewish people, these are what they are, and what do we do with them? So part of it is an interesting question of where did it come from, but more important is what do we do with them?
I'm going to try not to ask any more questions.
That's okay.
The thing that bothers me the most is I get all that, and they're not historically correct, possibly, but they're all example stories, and we have great brains now that are able to interpret, and then you have something like the Holocaust. And is this something like 3,000 years from now, somebody's going to be sitting here with a timeline and saying, and this is why the people in the year 3000, whatever, determined this happened. I mean, that almost, I don't want to say it erases everything for me, but you try to make sense out of all the stories, and then that happens, and that kind of like makes you think, well, this all makes sense, and it gives us examples of how we should live our life today, but like, it's such a big
the more that you
that it kind of like, I know some people I know that will say like, okay, that all makes sense, but then the Holocaust happened, so you start from there. Where's why did it happen? And it's such a big unexplainable thing that, and wiped out so many good Jewish people that you wonder how to believe anything from.
Yes.
You know what I mean?
Yes.
So.
Yes. But the only thing I could say, just by way of putting that together, is yes, 150, 200, 250 years from now, when the course of Jewish history has progressed there, people will be reinterpreting what we have just lived through. And they will do so depending on the fate of the state of Israel.
Right.
Because for many people, the fact that the war ended and 3 years later there was the founding of a Jewish state for the first time in 2,000 years may not be coincidence. People will read that as as they will. But that's the active, engaging part of being involved in the unfolding of Jewish history.
Yeah.
Okay.
Rabbi, can I just say anything to go over real fast?
Okay.
Just remember that, as Rabbi said, we're finite, and God is infinite. The language has not been invented for a finite group to understand an infinite being.
That's actually a very, very strong point, and I'm glad that you made it.
Thank you.
In that the language and the metaphor that we use is of human creation. The stories we choose to tell ourselves are of human creation because that's the only language we have. We don't have that divine super knowledge of infinite with God. But to pull the whole thing back full circle, it is the idea that this is the development of Jewish history progresses over time, and it starts in the book of Genesis. And I wanted to just point out to you how and what we're trying to do here essentially is unpack the layers of Jewish history. And there's a very interesting, because it would be lost. It's not the section that we read, and even if we read it, we wouldn't highlight it in shul on Shabbos. But this Shabbos, we read a very strange, out of the blue, random set of verses that has nothing to do with anything, and that you never learned in Hebrew school. So I brought it to you on the page. So in Exodus chapter 4, we're reading the book of Exodus. We just started reading the book of Exodus this week, and we're reading on Shabbos. And of course, Moses is blown off the palace life after 40 years of living there, and he's basically been doing his own hippie thing for 40 years, just being a shepherd in the desert, growing his hair long and taking care of the sheep, not a care in the world, and for 40 years, that's a long time. And then God appears to him at the burning bush and says, "This is not you. There's more to you than this. And here's your divine path forward." So he agrees reluctantly and says, "Okay, I'll re-engage with the world around me." So, and then they start a journey back. And in the middle of the journey, you get this strange thing. So Moses took his wife and his sons. By the way, same metaphor. I don't want to raise my family in a palace. It's not a good place. We'll spend our time between the UK and Canada. So Moses took his wife and his sons, who were born outside of Egypt, put them on a donkey, set out with them for Egypt, going back, carrying the walking staff, the God rod that he had given to him, that does all the tricks. And the Lord said to Moses, "Now that you're going back to Egypt, be sure to perform before the king all the miracles which I have given you the power to do. But I will make the king stubborn, and he will not let the people go." So before it even starts, Brad, you want to find difficult things to deal with. Before it even starts, you know how it's going to turn out, and the guy is not going to have free will. This is all right. There's plenty to work with here. He will not let the people go. You must tell him that I, the Lord, say, "Israel is my firstborn son. I told you to let my son go, that he may worship me, but you refused. Now I'm going to kill your firstborn son." So in the very beginning, before Moses ever comes back to Egypt, we're told how the story ends. The 10th plague is already there. Okay? All right. So far, so good. I got it. Okay? Here's the weird part. These 3 verses. At a camping place on the way to Egypt, the Lord met Moses and tried to kill him. Did you know that? Then Zipporah, his wife, took a sharp stone, cut off the foreskin of their son Gershom, and touched Moses' feet with it. That's weird. Because of the rite of circumcision, she said to him, "You are husband of blood to me." And so the Lord spared Moshe's life. That's it. It's just this one little unit. There's no explanation of it. Nothing in Torah ever goes back to it. It's just this little thing here. And I want to posit the reason why I think this little section is here, because circumcision was established in the book of Genesis when it was only one particular family. And now God wants to say, the Torah wants to say, that circumcision is going to be how other people will be able to join our community. That there's insiders and there's outsiders. And the way that you become an insider is through this bris, through this circumcision. And now when there's going to be millions of people, millions of Jews, this has to be the insider right. Because we don't know anything about Jewish education and what you had to do to convert. We don't know how the conversion process worked, how this continued larger and larger. But we know what you had to do to be part of it, and that's the circumcision. And when Moses himself could forget about it, because he was too busy doing something else, and his own wife has to remind him, and therefore save his life, that's the way that the Torah says this is branched out from one family to a huge global people. And how that Judaism becomes accessible to more and more people is what we're going to continue to talk about as we study Pirkei Avot. So thank you all for coming. That's the hour. And appreciate all the good questions and comments. And then I guess we'll continue. I'm going to collect those sheets. We need them for Live and Learn, except for you.